So hi everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. Sorry I was a little bit late signing on. We were just experiencing some technical difficulties. But my name's Amy, and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Lanark Regional Museum. We're very happy to have the opportunity to bring to you a digital speaker series in 2021, and today's event is brought to you in collaboration with Pride in Mississippi Mills. Pride in Mississippi Mills' mission is to create opportunities to celebrate, advocate, educate, and connect people respecting the full diversity of the 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. You are welcome to leave your cameras on, but we ask that you mute your microphones to limit any background noise. This presentation will be recorded, and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our official YouTube page. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of the presentation. The chat will be monitored, and you can post any questions that you may have there, and I will open up the floor to questions at the end if you're interested in asking your questions to our speaker directly. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce you to our speaker, Reverend Heather Kincaid. Heather is a semi-retired United Church minister who has officiated at more than 300 marriages during her 33 years of ministry. She holds 2 master's degrees from McGill University in sacred theology and family life education, and her thesis for the latter concentrated on blended families. We are very happy that Heather has taken the time to prepare this presentation for us as she presents From Simplicity to Complexity, Marital Changes in Canada.
Good afternoon, all you folks in Zoom land. This is one of my first times to do a big Zoom thing. So thanks to Amy for helping me out here at the museum. We're actually doing it at the museum because I'm such an amateur with my little computers at home. So it's a lovely sunny day out there, and I thank you for taking the time to be with us as we ponder the evolution of marriage over these past 156 years. And it's a real privilege to share this, this presentation in the context of Pride Month here in Lanark County. Now, at first glance, it might seem like a rather boring subject, but I hope you're going to be surprised to find the evolution of Canadian marriage turns out to be a fairly complex subject. So I want to begin by setting some parameters. Although I'll be throwing in some personal comments, most of the research comes from Statistics Canada and related sources. And I'm breaking this discussion into 4 timeframes. First, the Victorian period. Secondly, the first 50 years of the 20th century, the last 50 years of the 20th century, and this new millennium and the contemporary era in which we continue to live. And we need to remember that any discussion of marriage, regardless of the time frame, must always consider the familial, the social, and the historical context, like what was going on in the bigger worlds, such as war, or in the community, like recession, or in the family, like unemployment, or in the marriage, like separation and divorce. So to talk about marriage isn't an isolated topic. It's like throwing a pebble in the water, watching the rings ripple out, and realizing that all of this movement began with just 2 people deciding to either live together or get married. So let's go back all the way to the summer of 1865 with the wedding of Ginny Cameron and William McIntyre during pioneer days in Upper Canada. Transportation, we know, of course, was by horse and buggy. Farmlands were created by clearing the virgin forest by horse and manpower. And then a small barn and a small cabin were built with the harvested logs. Wells were dug by hand. And indeed, it's very hard for us to fathom all the hardships our pioneers endured in a world without electricity, telephone, powerful machinery, or instant messaging. Still known as St. Luke's Corner, the Cameron McIntyre families were part of a large Scottish immigration who settled in flat, fertile farming area just north of the St. Lawrence River near Cornwall. St. Luke's was a small, tight, interrelated community clustered around a Scottish Presbyterian church, its cemetery, and one-room schoolhouse. When they were married, Jenny was 16, Bill was 19. They were second cousins, and after studying at St. Luke's School, both went home to their respective families to assist on the family farm. Well, before I describe their wedding and marriage, it's fitting to tell you about my personal interest in the McIntyre family. In 1946, my parents bought a McIntyre farm from the second son, whose name was Sandy. A decade later, Sandy's daughter, Mary, gave us Jenny's brown two-piece wedding dress and bustle, the dress you see on your screen, to wear at costume parties. During the celebrations of Canada's centennial year, it was a real highlight because, of course, it was one of the few original dresses of the era. Fortunately, it escaped disaster from its various outings, so we were able to gift it to the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum in 2013 for preservation and posterity. In keeping with the era, Jenny and Bill's church wedding was a small, solemn ceremony, after which the families went to the Cameron home for a small, homegrown wedding feast. The newlyweds spent their very first night together, in a small room reserved especially for them in the McIntyre farmhouse, where they would live for the first 18 years of their marriage. With the addition of little William exactly 10 months after the wedding, he joined his parents in their bedroom, making 4 generations all living under the same roof, including great-grandmother Sadie. During their 32 years of marriage, Jenny and Bill would eventually build their own large frame farmhouse on the farm, give birth to 10 children, of which 4 would die in infancy, and live long enough to see their eldest 2 sons also work on the farm. Marital duties in those days were split along gender lines. William was responsible for cutting and hauling wood to keep the home fires burning, tending the livestock, seeding and harvesting the 50 acres of cleared land, and of course, all business matters. Meanwhile, Jenny looked after the house, nursing infants and tending children, hauling water and heating it on the wood stove for cooking, washing, and laundry, making meals using chickens, meat, milk, and eggs, all raised on the farm, knitting and sewing by lamplight at the end of a day, and tending any sick children or adults. A trip to Finch, which would be about 5 miles, or Newington, which was about 3 miles, would be where they would go for provisions by horse and buggy. And it was an all-day event, usually made by William. So Jenny seldom left the farm except for attendance at church or visits with family. Pioneer couples shared little private time together, and older children served as babysitters, kitchen helpers, and farm hands. William died in 1897, and Jenny lived the remainder of her years as a widow, totally dependent on her eldest son, who had inherited the farm when William died. They are buried in St. Luke's Cemetery, just a stone's throw from the McIntyre farm that my family bought 75 years ago. Now let's move on to the first 50 years of the last century and how Canadian marriage changed because of the two world wars and the Great Depression. Events that surely affected our grandparents, probably our parents, and maybe even our own lives. So consider for a moment some statistics. In 1914, the population in Canada was 8 million people. 424,000 went overseas to fight in Europe or were housed at military training camps in England. Of this number, more than 66,000 died and 173,000 were wounded. Or to put it another way, as Veterans Canada reports, nearly 1 in 10 Canadians who fought in the First World War did not return. Nearly 1 in 10 Canadians who fought in World War I never came home. Now let's put some flesh on these grim statistics and how marriage in Canada was affected in so very many ways. Thousands of married women were made widows and their children made fatherless. For those married men who did return home, whether or not they were injured, the marital relationship was forever changed. And for the very first time, thousands of women joined the workforce, fueling the war machine as they made munitions and uniforms, which gave women, of course, a taste of newfound freedom and their own paycheck. But also let's consider the war brides. Official statistics report that following demobilization, an estimated 54,000 relatives, both women and children, accompanied the returning Canadian troops. Thus, during the first 20 years of the 20th century, marriage in Canada began to assume a very different appearance, with many working women, foreign wives, physically and emotionally injured husbands, and widowed women with children. Well, after the jubilation of the Roaring Twenties, the whole world suffered during the Great Depression. Times were tough due to financial uncertainty, unemployment, poverty, and husbands joining the thousands who rode the rails in search of work. It was a most stressful time for marriages. And although we only have access to US statistics, it's reported that many couples stayed together because they couldn't afford the aftermath of divorce. Unemployment was at its highest in 1933. And as the unemployment rate declined through the late 30s, the rate of divorce increased. Following the depravity of the Great Depression was, of course, World War II. Canada's population at the time was 11.2 million. And over the 6 years of war, more than 41% of the male population between the ages of 18 and 45 voluntarily enlisted. Of the 1.1 million Canadians who served in the active army, more than 25,000 women enlisted. The war was costly. In human terms, more than 45,000 people were killed and another 54,000 were injured. Financially, it cost Canadian taxpayers more than $33 billion, and that's in those times. Between 1942 and 1947, 70,000 war brides with their children came to Canada. And after leaving behind the hardships of war-torn Europe, these immigrant families were ill-adapted to the multiple changes of their new lives in Canada. Like the previous World War of the 20th century, a new generation of wives worked outside the home, and thousands of husbands returned home maimed for life, both in body and in spirit. Many wartime marriages never really recovered from the multiple stresses associated with domestic abuse and violence. And of course, these were totally taboo and silent subjects at the time. With the two wars and depression finally behind us, the world needed some good news for the second half of the 20th century. And who could imagine that it would come in the form of a tiny little pill? With women joining the workforce, there was an increasing need for an effective, safe method of birth control. So let's look at a little bit of history behind birth control. As early as 1839, Charles Goodyear produced rubber condoms, intrauterine devices, douching syringes, and diaphragms. In 1873, however, the American Congress passed the Comstock Law, prohibiting the dissemination of any information related to human sexuality and abortion. It would take nearly a century, in fact, 1965, before this law was overturned by a court challenge, ruling that the private use of contraceptives was a constitutional right. In the interval, after watching her mother die from multiple complications of birthing 11 children, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in 1916. And 20 years later, physicians were legally allowed to mail birth control devices and information throughout America. In 1950, Sanger met with a man called Gregory Pincus, a distinguished researcher in the biology of hormones and steroids, about creating an oral contraceptive. Using her $15 million inheritance, a woman called Catherine McCormick funded the research. In 1957, the pill was marketed by Cyril Pharmaceuticals as a treatment for gynecological disorders. In 1960, it gained international approval. And the rest we can say is her story. The sexual aspect of marriage would never be the same again. And to give you an idea of the pill's implications on the Canadian population, think about these stats. In 1950, the average number of children per woman in Canada was 2.74. In 2000, that number decreased to 1.15. And last year in 2020, the birth rate was 1.03 for each woman in Canada. Now, I don't know how a woman produces 0.3% of a child. But that's what the most recent statistics say. On the other side of contraception is the problem of infertility, which has been answered by in vitro fertilization. Canada's first IVF baby was born in 1983. And the miracle of modern science continues to bring hope to couples who once thought they would be forever childless. And it seems appropriate to mention here now that the little pill Viagra is nearly 25 years old, and it promises to keep the sexual aspect of marriage going for all time. Now, I ran this by Amy, and she said I could do it. So the man says to the woman, "Did you take your pill today?" And she says, "Yes." And she says to him, "And have you taken your pill there tonight?" And he says, "Yes." And together they say, "Let's get on with it." Well, a huge change in the marital unit occurred in the 1980s when the phenomenon of cohabitation, living together or common law marriage, lost its social stigma. Stats Canada originally defined this as two persons of the opposite sex who are not legally married to each other, who live together as husband and wife in the same dwelling. And subsequently, this was amended to include same-sex relationships. Common law relationships, including same-sex relationships, grew rapidly. 1981 stats show 6.3% of all couples weren't married. In 2016, cohabitation accounted for nearly 21.3% of all census families. StatsCan reports that in January 2018, more than one half of all Canadians thought that legal marriage was either not that important or not at all important for couples planning to be together long term. In 2005, the Federal Civil Marriage Act legalized same-sex marriage in Canada. The definition for husband and wife was amended to spouse, and the definition for dependent children became enfant à charge to protect same-sex spouses and their children. The 2016 Canadian census reports nearly 73,000 same-sex couples. Of these, 1/3 were legally married and 2/3 were in common law relationships. Same-sex couples often bring children into the relationship or plan to have biological children of their own. For example, our gay cousin and his common law partner live in Toronto. They chose to father a child by IVF with their own sperm and a lesbian mother. In 2004, the Assisted Human Reproduction Act gave Canada a legal framework to manage surrogate pregnancy, and thereby made it a criminal offense to pay a woman to act as a surrogate to have a child. So our cousin is now completing high school. She has 2 fathers, 2 mothers, 3 step-siblings, 2 half-siblings, and 4 sets of grandparents. And all the joys and complications that go with a thoroughly contemporary blended family in Canada. So let's look at childcare. When both the husband and wife began employment outside the home, a shift in the division of household duties soon occurred. Consider that in 1950, 22% of women worked outside the home. In 1950, 1/5 of women worked outside the home. In 2019, that statistic ballooned to 84%. Over time, most husbands increasingly assume parental duties, including cooking and housekeeping tasks. And if you don't believe me, just look at today's modern dads and see what they do. During this same period, preschool children began to spend weekdays at babysitters or daycare. And so in 2019, more than 60% of Canadian children were in some form of childcare. As a result of paid parental leave for a child's first year, 76% of infants are cared for by their parents. And although universal childcare remains controversial in Canada, all we need to do is ask parents how badly they have missed daycare while simultaneously working at home and looking after the kids or even helping the kids for schoolwork during these many months of COVID-19. So often the question is asked, is a common law relationship the same as marriage in Ontario? And the answer to that is no. If the legally married relationship breaks down, provincial laws regarding divorce are already in place. But a cohabitation agreement is a domestic agreement, a contract. And unlike divorce, in a common law breakdown, provincial laws regarding inheritance, property rights, pensions, length of time of living together, etc., are murky and in a state of flux. Or as one resource writes, cohabitation does not have fancy, nice legal goalposts. Living together does not have nice, fancy legal goalposts. So let's move on to a very modern phenomenon, and that's online dating. Modern matchmaking now includes online dating. And second only by introductions face-to-face by a friend, computerized websites are now the most popular way to find a mate. In Canada, online dating has a $146 million market and 379 business sites. $146 million worth of market and 379 business sites. The BC-based site Plenty of Fish alone has 100 million worldwide users. Some other statistics reveal that 36% of Canadians have used online dating sites. Men are the most likely to use them. 16% report having had sex online. 53% lie about their profile. And women are more likely to look for a permanent match, not just a hookup. Current statistics also show that 20% of online daters have gone on to a committed relationship. One critic, however, writes that the online dating market is too frictionless, too easy to enter, too easy to exit, and too easy to transact within. Well, it's really too soon to know how computer matchmaking will affect the future of marriage, but we all know that it's definitely here to stay. So let's move on to divorce. While weddings and marriage registration in Canada fall under provincial jurisdiction, the Divorce Act is a federal law. In 1900, less than 15 divorces were granted in all of Canada. The only legal ground at the time for divorce was adultery, unless, of course, you had lots and lots of money to petition the Canadian government. In 1968, the Canadian Divorce Act legislated that a divorce could be granted on the grounds of marriage breakdown if the couple could prove they had been living separately for at least 3 years. Over the next 2 years, the divorce rate jumped by almost 200%. In 1986, the Divorce Act was amended to shorten the waiting time to 12 months. In this 21st century, studies show that the lowest risk of divorce is during the first year of marriage. The risk peaks around the 4th anniversary, and people who marry for a second time are more likely to divorce again. During the last 20 years, the number of divorced persons in Canada rose by more than 1/3 to 2.6 million, with nearly 38% of marriages in Canada ending in divorce. And that's from the most current Canadian statistics. So all of this discussion about divorce brings us to the subject of remarriage and the multiple challenges of blended or step families. The 2016 census reports that 1 in 10 children lived in a step family. The Canadian census breaks step families into 2 categories: a simple step family with biological or adopted children belonging to only one partner. And then there are complex step families with biological or adopted children, including any combination of mine, yours, and ours. Of all step families, 33 were simple step families, while 33% were complex. Now, if you're part of step family arrangements, you know all about the complexities. Where are the bicycles? Or where are the skates? Who's going to have the children for Christmas and the summer holidays? Can feuding spouses mutually agree on the best interests of the child without going to expensive lawyers? How do 4 sets of in-laws and grandparents fit into this complicated scenario? The list could go on and on and on, but most of us know what I'm talking about. Now, as much as marriage has evolved over these past 156 years, one aspect of family life in some circumstances has returned to pioneer times, and that is multi-generational households. In 2011, nearly 5% of children under 14 years of age lived with parents or a parent and at least one grandparent. Details from the 2016 census show that the trend that nearly 35% of young adults ages 20 to 34 live with one parent. Although such living arrangements are fraught with many problems, it appears that financially and emotionally, it can be a win-win situation. But as I report that, I often wonder what Jenny and William McIntyre would say, given that their families in their generation in the late 1800s didn't have any choice. So on that note, let's summarize and compare the 1865 marriage of William and Jenny and how it differs from a marriage of 2021. And we have a wonderful little, good. Thank you, Amy. Somebody that knows how to use a computer, you see. So we're going to look at this graph, I guess we could call it, and we're going to go through the various topics and see how they have changed in this 156 years. So we're going to start with community. And of course, in the days of the McIntyres, it was rural or a village and very restricted. People didn't travel very much. And now we have a world with absolutely no boundaries. no boundaries at all. Transportation in those days would have been horse and buggy or riding the horse, perhaps a boat or walking. And now we have so many opportunities: car, train, plane, boat, spaceship. The world is our oyster now. Home services, everything was done by hand. The water was hauled, the wood was hauled, etc. And now all we do is flick a switch. We hardly know where our electricity comes from, or where the sewage goes, or the water, especially if you live in town, or central heating, or air conditioning. Just one of those things that we take for granted, all of those home services that we have now. Next is communication, which in those days would have been letter or sending a message. And now, of course, communication is endless. Telephone, computer, internet, instant messaging, you name it, a great change. Back in 1865, the age of marriage was usually teens or young 20s. And the last statistics we have on this is 2008. And it's interesting that the government isn't keeping track of age of marriage anymore, which is one of the things I discovered in getting this ready. In 2008, the average age of women to be married was 29.6 years, and men was 31.6 years. And it would be interesting how much that may have changed in the last 13 years, but they're not keeping statistics on it anymore. Introduction. Back in those days, it would have been family or friends or a church service or maybe a community gathering. Now it can be friends or family, but as we noticed before, a great concentration on online sites, meeting total strangers online and setting up dates with them. Dating would have been pretty confined to church and community. And now, of course, there's online, but also there's this whole unlimited universal entertainment that people can participate in, even, for instance, to a Zoom call. You can date in so very many ways today. In religion, the McIntyres were Scottish Presbyterian for life. I know the 5th generation now, and they're Presbyterians, Canadian Presbyterians, not Scottish Presbyterians. But now religion has taken a different turn. There's a decline of Christianity, an increase in world religions, particularly here in Canada. There's a very large component that has no religion at all. And then there's also those who call themselves spiritual, but not religious. Marriage, of course, was only a man and a woman. Now it can be a man and a woman, a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. Ethnicity, everybody seemed to stay within their own race or religion. Now we have mixed ethnic marriages being extremely common. Cohabitation, I have seldom down, probably you could say never, almost. And an interesting thing about cohabitation now is that it's actually a major stage in dating. So most couples that come to be married these days have already lived together for some years. It is, in fact, a stage of dating. I'm going to skip that marriage part right there and go down to the first home. So the first home was usually with the parents. Now the first home will be with the to-be spouse or a common law partner or perhaps never able to afford a first home, perhaps always living in a rented unit. Financial obligations back in those days would be family and savings. Financial obligations now could be family, car or cars, education, mortgage, debts, RRSP, savings, you name it. There's many ways to spend your money these days. Birth control was natural in those days, and now it's mostly artificial, except for certain religious groups who do not believe in artificial birth control, but the majority of people do. First pregnancy was usually soon after marriage because there was no birth control. Now it's deferred until a couple feels ready or willing or able. Surrogacy and artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization, of course, was unheard of in those days. Now common for same-sex marriage and also as a remedy for infertility. Children. Most families had many children. Many, of course, children died in infancy. There was no birth control. And if you lived on a farm, you needed the help. Now children are seen to be raised for pleasure or lineage or for some other reason. Child rearing was usually done by mothers and mother and grandmothers or older kids in the family. And now it's private, public daycare, relatives, or parents. Work back in those days was gender-based. Now there are no gender barriers. Both work outside the home. We have young women training to be fire people, and we have men who make wonderful nurses. So there's no gender boundaries anymore. Divorce, as we saw before, was rare. In the 2000 statistics, more than 1/3 of marriages will end in divorce. The breadwinner was the husband in the old days, and now it's both spouses. A blended family was rare unless there was a death in the family or a widow or widower remarried. And a blended family now is common as a result of divorce and remarriage. So let's move back up then to marriage, which is in the middle, right there. So you may remember way back at the beginning, we threw out a little bit of a question that only one thing remains constant in these 156 years. And this is it. That marriage continues to be a legal and provincial thing. You need a license to be married in Ontario, and you need the same license registers the marriage in Ontario. Civic and religious, every marriage is a civic ceremony and sometimes a religious ceremony, but they remain legal. Cohabitation, on the other hand, is not legal and is not government registered. So of all of these things that we have looked at, the only thing that really remains is that marriage still remains legal. I'd invite any questions.
Now you hear me? So I'm congratulating Heather for all her research and information. And when I see that all there, I really feel fortunate to live in the time I did. You didn't have as many choices as, your life was sort of laid out for you more than now. You have so many choices, especially if you're a woman, that you didn't have before. And I certainly wouldn't want to get into online dating. I think minefield.
You hear me?
Yeah.
The only thing I'm disappointed, Heather, is that you didn't have any slides to illustrate all that.
What, the online dating? Marilyn, you need to know that some of the biggest online dating sites are for seniors. Just, you know, if you were interested, there's lots and lots of choice. Like they say, plenty of fish.
I said I've got real selfish as a widow. I'm just quite happy to stay that way. Anyway, it's a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I ask Reverend Kincaid, as I know you are a United Church minister, I'm in a United Church that's working on being affirming. And what one interest we have is how it may be different for same-sex marriage in the church as the traditional man-woman. Do you have any comments on that?
Are you meaning that there would be a difference?
Yeah, I guess, is there a difference then? And
No, there's not a difference. So it's interesting. The provincial government has modified the marriage license. I would say probably in the last 5 years, and in the previous years, it was always the man, the woman, etc. And now it's like spouse one, spouse two. So they have modified it. So you wouldn't know whether, depending on what the names are, you wouldn't know whether it was two men or two women or a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. So, and it still remains, the argument over marrying in the church, and I can vouch for this because I had married some people not in the church when it was discovered that I was marrying people who were gay. And so there was quite a bit of a discussion about that, but I was given permission at the beginning to marry outside the church. And then as people's hearts melted or were moved, it was all right to marry in the church. And I have married some people in the church, but more gay people outside the church. That's the other thing, and it didn't get included in the that last page, but church weddings now are extremely rare because of people's lack of interest in religion. And it seems to be so convenient to go to a big place and have everything, the marriage vows, the reception, the dance, everything all in one place. And so, which is the other thing, is that we clergy are doing increasingly less marriages because there's a big market for people who've done a government course and are given a license to marry.
I see. Thank you.
Hi, Heather. It's Debbie McNeil. I enjoyed your speech. I went into it thinking that that it would illustrate a harder time for marriage, but if anything, I came away thinking that there is no easy way to have a successful marriage in terms of cultural and gender roles and all of that. So I want to thank you again for just opening my eyes to a different way of thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rose,
hello.
Hi, Rose.
I think I'm unmuted. Yes, I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I'm lying in bed because it's so darn comfortable. Heather, thank you very much. I mean, that's a remarkable presentation of all the various factors possible in a marriage. And on top of that, you've done it in a historical perspective. So, wow to you. I wonder about one thing, and I'm sure you're right, but I'm just wondering about it. You know, it is possible, I'm sure you know that, to get a legal contract for cohabitation through a lawyer. I mean, lots of people don't know that and they don't do it, but it is possible to do that. And I'm wondering whether, and I think that gets registered somewhere. I don't know exactly where. I'm wondering if you wanted to mention that or talk about that at all.
That's a real nebulous thing, because yes, you can go to a lawyer, etc. Whether it gets registered or not provincially, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, neither am I, but I mean, that was my impression.
It's like they say, the goalposts are different. You know, so yes, because, you know, for those of us that have been in the agricultural world, and I don't know if you've seen what the price of a good piece of land is these days.
Yeah.
But if a couple are married, let's say for 25 years, and they decide to divorce, and the land is worth $1 million, if they're living together, that could be nebulous. If they're married, it has to be split 50-50.
Well,
so it would be worth it, Rose. It's something that would be worth pursuing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I speak somewhat from personal experience that that if you go to a lawyer, I mean, a reputable lawyer, and there is a contract, and unless you decide otherwise, you the couple has the same contractual, in terms of property, the same contractual legal definition as if they were had a civil marriage. So if you don't want that, if you want something different, then you have to change it. You know, if you decide, for instance, you whatever you brought into the relationship, each partner one is prepared to take out from the relationship and nothing other, you can have that. But so I think there is a certain protection. I think that's what I'm trying to say. There's a certain protection if you go through and have a legal cohabitation contract registered with at least the lawyers. I don't know where it goes from there. That's the only thing I'm not clear about. But there is something. The problem is that most people don't know about it. That's the problem, I think. So they think that if they live legally together, then they are, which happens after 2 or 3 years, then they have the same kind of an arrangement, just sort of naturally or whatever, that they would have if they were actually had a legal marriage, which is not the case. You actually have to sign a contract, and you can't just do it between the two of you. It has to be legally done, and it has to be deposited somewhere. But where, I'm not absolutely sure. But there is a legal contract that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
So
thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. It is, but the contract with a common law couple is a domestic contract.
Yes, it is. But it deals with all the issues of inheritance. Mm-hmm. You know, yeah, it is. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. Please,
no.
Please understand.
No, I understand that because it's that's a topic in itself.
Yes.
You know,
and a very interesting topic at that.
Very
yes.
interesting topic. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But thank you. That's a wonderful presentation, Heather. And I'll be knocking on your door or whatever to get copies of it and talk to you more about it.
I can email it to you.
Oh, that would be terrific. Okay,
Great.
thank you very
And I
much.
can email it to anybody. If you give Amy the addresses, I'll be glad to email it because it's on the computer. And I know how to do that.
Heather,
Yes.
with what Rose said, with the changes in people not getting married and cohabitating, and religion losing, especially in Canada, losing its, its role in a marriage. Do you think that down the road that we'll see laws change to protect both people in a cohabitation?
I think they'll have to change.
Yeah.
I think they'll have to change because of the numbers.
Yeah.
And when you think of, how hard the gay couples had to work to get marriage legalized for them, I think it's only a matter of time that somehow or another it has to change. And it especially I think with especially within the cohabitation thing with so many blended families and the children. And
yeah, I was going to say with children involved, you'd think that is there something to protect or not protect the children, but to I guess to help the children in the event of a breakup of a cohabitation legally right now?
I don't think anything more than what's provided through government services, or unless people want to, excuse me, go the route of private counseling or something.
Okay, thank you.
But that's a really good question, because I think it's a place for some of us that have many friends and relatives that are living together to say, hey, are you interested in this changing? It's like the divorce rate changing. I mean, look at what happened in 1900. You couldn't, only a minimum of scarce minimum, because you had to have the money.
That's right.
So I think personally, I think it has to change, and hopefully sooner than later. Because there's too much at stake.
That's right.
As the children, but also property and etc.
That's right.
Other questions?
Looks like no. So we'll actually just close out. You'll hear me for 1 second, but I wanted to give a big thank you again to Heather for taking the time to prepare this presentation for us. Your perspective on marriage in Canada was so unique and a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on the changes that we've seen over time. And we also want to once again thank Pride in Mississippi Mills for their collaboration on this project, and we're happy to be a part of their 2021 celebrations. To those in our audience, thank you once again for your support of the North Lanark Historical Society. We're constantly aiming to improve our programming and would therefore appreciate it if you would complete a brief survey on today's event, the link for which will be sent to you by email. We hope that you've enjoyed today's event, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.